Anin, Buju, Hamida Kipi, Yahipi Kinwashte. Good morning, everyone. It's 9 a.m. and it's the second day of our Dakota and Ojibwe Languages Symposium. And I have the honor and privilege to introduce the keynote this morning with Deanna Standing Cloud, Anton Troyer. So if you don't know who he is, get to know who he is. He is a great speaker from Misquagami Wizaga Iganing. I'm very humbled and inspired by Anton's work, even as a Dakota speaker and Dakota learner. Seeing the things that I watched that documentary that you were featured in, Anton, and I was, it's just really excited to be here and really excited to introduce you. So, Deanna. Unmute yourself, Deanna.
Oh, I have so many tabs open right now. It's like my brain. I would be embarrassed if I did my screen share right now because you don't want to see the tabs in my life. But Buju everyone, Mino Gikije Bawagad, Gete Bikwe Indigenous, Minowa Baganagijek Wabamakwe Indigo, Magaziandudem, Misquagami Wizag Iganing and Dunjaba. Welcome, Bindi Gain, relatives, Mahamatakiapi. My name is Deanna Standing Cloud. Welcome to day 2 of the Dakota and Ojibwe Language Symposium. Welcome, welcome. It looks like we have a good group already filing in. Indian time, a 9:03, that's not necessarily Indian time, but we'll say it. I just wanted to welcome you all. It's such a beautiful day. It's pretty cold, but that fresh air going outside, and I put out some tobacco today. There's a lot of heaviness in my heart today, so it's really good to be here talking about language, because I realize like the work of learning our language is a spiritual endeavor as well. So we're always integrating a lot of the spiritual energy as well. So I just wanted to be mindful about that and just say that out loud. I'm smudging, so getting my medicines going, but it's gonna be a good morning. I hope we all get something really good from this and we connect in a good way and we get something new, and we also reiterate some of the teachings that we already have inside of us. So welcome everybody. So the symposium is sponsored by the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council Language Revitalization Working Group and partnering also with the Minnesota Humanities Center, and is funded through the Arts and Cultural Heritage portion of the Legacy Amendment. So this work has been going on for some years, and it's really good work. And it is my honor today to hand it over to my buddy Wagush. There's a bio here, but I think you guys may be familiar with this guy or may not, who knows, he may be a new face for you guys. But Dr. Anton Troyer is a professor at Bemidji State University. He's an American Indian academic and author specializing in Ojibwe language and American Indian studies. He is a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University, Minnesota, and a 2008, oh my gosh, is this a German word? Guggenheim Fellow. You have to tell me how to say that, Tony. After serving as an assistant professor at the history of the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee from 1996 to 2000, Troyer returned to his home of Bemidji as professor of Ojibwe, a position, holy, geez, I might as well just speak Ojibwe, a position he still holds today. He has published extensively in linguistics and Ojibwe language. He is widely recognized as one of the most prolific scholars of Ojibwe and at the forefront of a movement to textualize this formally oral language in hopes of preserving and revitalizing it. Oh, I got through that paragraph. It is my honor to welcome Tony Wagush Troyer. So welcome, Tony. I'm gonna get off the mic now.
Chimigwech gakanaginawa, gipejayeg, nongum gekajeb, nimigwechu endam, nimigwechu itagos, hinenimiguan bajayan, we wenigod nandigikendaman, Asia Chagewad, Chinibua, Anishinabeg, in Diji Kamawad, Gidinwewin Inanan, Yo Buani Mowin, Minawa, Anishinabe Mowin, Nyanjago, Minawa God, Windamunagug, Bungi Geabi, Hawian, Wagosh, Indigu, Minawa Migizi, Indodem, Azagasquaji Mekag, and Dunjaba. Just so excited to see you all today and to see all of the work that so many people are doing. I'm getting a little older now. I'm in my 50s. And when I was starting this work, you could count the number of books, you know, in either Ojibwe or Dakota on a couple of hands. And there are so many hundreds of them now. I can't even tell you how many there are. Many, many people have been doing heroic work. And there are lots of schools, programs, and initiatives. And I really appreciate Minnesota Indian Affairs, also the Minnesota Humanities Center for their efforts to pull us all together so we can learn from one another. I think this is a really worthwhile and important effort. Nahau, kamada unyo o. So as I've been engaging on this language journey, like many other people, we've had successes and we've had setbacks. We've had a lot of losses of really wonderful fluent speakers, elders, culture carriers, everyone a heartbreak in its own right. And we've also seen some remarkable accomplishments. I feel like what we are looking at in our collective efforts leaves me feeling that the future vitality of a language like Ojibwe or Dakota, it's not certain, but it's certainly possible. And it really depends on the depth and breadth of our interventions and efforts to strengthen, stabilize, and teach our languages and cultures going forward. And I just wanted to preface my remarks here by saying that, number one, we are exactly where we should be, having been through all of the things that we have been through as Native people. When you look at the history of, genocide, colonization, the residential boarding schools, even the way we run most of our contemporary schools, there has been a pretty consistent assault on our languages, cultures, and ways of being. So it is not the fault of our elders for failure to teach, and it is not the fault of our young people for failure to learn. We're right where we should be. And we still, in spite of 500 pretty rough years, have these languages, have our cultures, and have the capacity to engineer meaningful, positive change about the things we truly care about. At the same time, I think it's also important to note that we have permission to change over time. We don't have to look like we just stepped off the set from Dances with Wolves to be authentically Indigenous. And it is important that we give ourselves permission to adapt and change. In fact, something like the Ojibwe language, the Ojibwe culture, as it was in 1491, was pretty different from Ojibwe language and culture as lived in 1691, and different then to 1891 and to today. If we tried to live and speak exactly as people did in 1491, we would surely perish. We have to adapt our cultural toolbox, and a living language, as both Ojibwe and Dakota are, also have to adapt to our current environment, times, and so forth. All languages do this. Just think about the English words, motherboard and firewall, which might have freaked somebody out 50 years ago, but are pretty common today. We have to shift and change. I've had experiences before where someone was, coming up saying, hey, you guys shouldn't be writing our language down. We never used to do that. Ours is an oral language. And I'm usually thinking, did you really drive over here in a car to register this complaint? We have permission to and have to change over time. And at the same time, I think it's a fair question to ask, how much can a people change and still be the same people? The DNA of the ancient Druids who are worshiping at Stonehenge still flows through the veins of people in England today. But at what point did they diverge so much that they were less recognizable to one another? So for us in the language revitalization universe, there is this tension between linguistic and cultural continuity, which is truly important, and linguistic and cultural change, which is also truly important. And what I'd like to do today is share a little bit about my personal journey and the journey of my family, and then share a little bit about what's in the toolbox and current efforts going on today. As we do this, I think it's really important that we unburden ourselves with shame, feelings of unworthiness, the idea that we are less than because we didn't get everything handed on a silver platter. You are a complete, fully realized human being. You are a soul who has a body. You are the one your ancestors were praying for and waiting for through the generations. You've been given a unique set of gifts, and you yourself are a gift to the world. So this is a picture of Betsy Schultz. She was one of my elders, loved dearly. And I'd spent a lot of time with her father, the late Archie Mosaic, Niba Gijik, and really just kind of stumbled into a life-altering journey with him. And Betsy was always there along for the ride. Archie had 8 children, and really most of them got to live very long lives. In fact, some of his children are still with us today, some of our esteemed elders like Dora Ammon and Dan Mosaic and others. But Betsy was one who was always right in the mix with all of the language and culture work I was doing with her dad. And she was so kind and sweet to me. When we met, she'd kiss me on both cheeks. She'd hug me close. She was super supportive and always made me feel super welcome. She was also someone that all the kids in, our ceremony circles were a little terrified of, because she had the perfect, like, mean Indian look, her kind of dark glasses and things like that. And she would give someone a tough look or shake her cane at them. And they'd go, hustle to do whatever she was saying. She's holding my firstborn daughter here, Gijigukwe, Madeline. And I remember when Archie died, which was in 1996, about a year later, the custom in Round Lake, which is one of the villages on the St. Croix Reservation in Wisconsin on the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, the custom over there was that a year after someone's passing, they would have a bundle that they would bring to the ceremonial drums, and they would break the bundle, bring the family out of mourning. And I remember, driving over to the ceremony thinking, I wonder who's even going to be speaking at this event, because Archie, even when he was well into his 90s, was just so revered that he was asked to do all the speaking at that ceremony. And he even did a great share of the singing. And I remember driving over there, I have no idea who's going to be talking. This is crazy. I came into the dance hall, and to me, it was a regal place, although frankly, it was a kind of rundown building with kid fingerprints smudged all over the walls, and layers of cigarette smoke from ceremony and social smokings and things like that. But to me, it was a really special place, and the people were so special and tenacious. And as I came in there, I sat down, and here came Betsy. And for the first time in my whole life, she was giving me the, like, mean Indian look. And she came over, she had a pouch of tobacco in her hand, And she said, you're going to be talking today. And I've been watching you follow my dad around all these years, and I'm going to hear what you learn. By the way, he never forgot anybody's native name, and he never forgot anything they were asking for when they handed tobacco. And so she handed me this tobacco, and she had a line of people behind her lined up. There were 13 of them, each with a pouch of tobacco with a special request and a bowl of food that they were setting down at the drum. And I remember just feeling like the smallest little kid and just completely terrified. And so I had pouches of tobacco between every finger, and bunches in my hands. And I stood up and I did the invocation and spoke for the bowls. And then I just kind of gave one, wary glance over to Betsy, and she just kind of looked at me and said, and shook her cane at the kids to go eat out of the bowls. And after that, there was kind of no avoiding the tobacco and the expectation that I would step up and do something. And even today, I still feel kind of terrorized, or terrified and humbled with the thought that I should be doing anything. I consider myself an extremely unlikely candidate to know anything about our language or our culture, much less to be someone who's asked to speak to those things. And there are a lot of reasons why I've considered myself an unlikely candidate. One is my wonderful, beautiful father, who's not native at all. He was actually born in Vienna, Austria. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant, a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He and actually both of his parents and 2 cousins ended up making it out of there. Everyone else was killed in the Nazi Holocaust. Eventually, he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom. Here I am. But as a result of this, he appreciated and respected Indigenous people, but he was never a fluent speaker of our language. And while he would support my mother and me, my siblings in our various efforts, it meant that the language he shared with my mom, English, was the language of the home. There's more to say about him, but I'm going to move a little more quickly to take you through this family journey. I have to look back to Indana Kobijigan, my great-grandmother, to find the generation in my family when Ojibwe was the language that everybody spoke to each other at the dinner table, to all the kids in the house, and it was the language that everybody used. By the way, it's interesting to note in Ojibwe, the word Anikobijigan is used for my great-grandparent, and it's the same word that's used for my great-grandchild. While we have words for myself, Neen, my parents, Ninigugug, my children, and Ninijanasug, my grandmas and grandpas, Nokumisug, Nimshomisug, my grandchildren, Nojisheg, Indana Kobijigan. On both ends of that, it's the same word. And what the word really means is my line. So I feel like and know there's both a biological and cultural and spiritual dimension to this. I am the product of what my ancestors were doing 7 generations ago. That's the Anikobijigan spans 7 generations. And 7 generations ago, someone whose name I don't even know was putting out tobacco and food and praying that our language would live, that, I might have a decent chance at a long, healthy, happy life. And so today, I think of 7 generations from now, when no one will know my name, hoping, praying, and doing everything I can to make sure that they have a decent chance at long, healthy, happy lives, to carry our language, our culture, to know who they are, with everything that means. So that was Indana Kobijigan. This is my grandmother, Luella Seeley, who's actually especially well known throughout, Leech Lake, White Earth, and so forth. By the way, my kubi came from White Oak Point, the Ojibwe community that was over kind of near Grand Rapids and had been relocated into Bena with other members of her family. And my grandmother grew up and she got to be immersed in our language, but she was also, as a very young child, sent to residential boarding school. And it broke the intergenerational transmission of the language in our family. And so even as my grandmother came out of residential boarding school and made it back to Bena, at the same time, she thought she might be doing a favor to my mom not to share the language. She had her own, traumas from that experience. And even my grandfather, who, was also a Bena kid, native guy, also grew up with similar experiences to her, ended up, enlisting in the US Army, went down to Fort Snelling to enlist in the US Army in World War II. And he actually, I looked at his enlistment card, he wrote white on there. I should have put a picture of him in there because he's like the darkest native, And so he just thought it would save him persecution. And so this was, the environment that my mother grew up in, experiencing, I think, some pretty visceral poverty. And some parts of our cultural toolbox, here's some pictures of my mom through phases of her life. And, I think for her, some parts of the cultural toolbox were very common. Like they went snaring rabbits, hunting, fishing. All the kids had to produce food and go harvest wild rice, for example. Not so much because it was a cool cultural pastime, but as much as it was a necessary means of survival. But at the same time, the language wasn't the living language in her home. Even though it was there in her mom, it wasn't used in the raising of children. And so there was kind of a difference to her experience with our language and culture. By the way, when she went to school, she only met one professional Native person ever. And that person was the school nurse. So she thought, well, maybe I can do that. So she went on and became a nurse. And then she took a job for the tribe's health program and said, wow, Native people are getting pushed around so bad. I got to do something about that. And she ended up pursuing a law degree, and she became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. And so it was very formative for me, watching my mom with her powwow braids, suit, and sorrel boots, navigate institutions of whiteness and patriarchy with great success. And I think that was formative for me. It showed me a lot of things, among them the power of an education, which is undeniable. And at the same time, I'm still kind of with George Carlin, the old comedian, who said, nah, we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. Meaning simply that there are barriers out there, and those barriers are not equitably distributed by race, gender, and a whole bunch of other things. So as my mother grew up, dealing with, on the one hand, this kind of rich everyday lived culture, but also a break in the transmission of our language and some of our other, I think, ceremonial life. She was on a journey of her own, not just with her career, but with her culture. And as a child, I was never baptized. We were hauled off to ceremony all the time. She was interested in learning about those things, relearning them, teaching them to us. And I was along for the ride as a kid, but I think also deeply inspired and impacted by some of the things that I saw, especially in our ceremony space. There were also humble beginnings. You could say my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty when she was getting started. My dad was hitting a restart button in his life. There was a time when we had a little cabin that didn't have electricity or running water. We had an outhouse, we had a little hand pump, but we spent all of our time picking berries, snaring rabbits, making maple syrup and sugar. This part of the cultural toolbox my mom was really intent upon showing to us. But we'd wash up in a creek in the summer, enamel wash basins in the winter, But I saw big changes. As I mentioned, I was in about middle school when my mom got her law degree and eventually built a nice house for us. And to me, this is me as a little tyke washing up in the creek. That's like dinosaur ages to my kids. And it's harder for them to even relate to that experience. So this is Archie Mosaic, Miba Gijik. I probably traumatized my parents in a number of ways, but among them, when I was in high school, my goal was to get out of town and never come back. And I think naively thought that there was a way to escape from the brambled racial borderland of my youth. And it was kind of rough at times. I got into Princeton University and I thought, hooray, I've escaped from all the, stupid people or whatever. And I think the first questions I got at Princeton were like, oh, dude, you're native. Where's your tomahawk? And I remember thinking, these are the dumbest smart people I've ever met. And it's the brambled racial borderland will follow me everywhere I go. I ended up having a good experience in college, but at the end of it, I abandoned my own plans to like become a lawyer, follow my mom's footsteps that way. I thought I might be an okay lawyer, but I think I'd be miserable trying to do it. There's nothing like leaving home to make you appreciate what you just left behind. And I told my parents, well, I'm coming home and my plan is to like walk the earth. I want to learn about our language. I want to learn about our culture. And they said, well, we support you wholeheartedly, but we're not paying for any of it. Good luck. And I ended up wanting to find Archie Mosaic in large part because he was simply one of the most famous spiritual leaders of that time. And this is before cell phones and things like that. So I literally hopped in a car and I drove from Leech Lake across Minnesota into Wisconsin over to Balsam Lake. So Balsam Lake and Round Lake are these kind of communities on the St. Croix Reservation adjacent to one another. Balsam Lake's where he lived. And I took out a phone book from a phone booth. We still had phone booths and phone books in those days, and started looking up mosaics. And I started calling. The first one I caught was his son, Dan, who was hazing me and making sure I wasn't a serial killer or something like that, but eventually realized I was a Native person interested in ceremony, gave me directions. Went over to Archie's house, and I thought, as this important spiritual leader, he'd be sitting there smoking a pipe, praying for world peace and things like that. But he was watching a WWF SmackDown on a TV, laughing really loud, and all by himself. And I came in the house, and he looked over at me and he said, oh, shut off the TV. I've been waiting for you. And I remember thinking, well, how could you be waiting for me? You don't even know who I am. But he had a dream about someone, and I looked like this person in his dream. And so he just kind of opened the door to me. I ended up living with him, sleeping on his couch, being his gopher, go for this, go for that, driving him around to funerals and ceremonies. And he could speak some English, but really not that well. I remember driving him to the bank because he had a little pension check from the Polk County Highway Department. He used to drive truck, and he couldn't endorse the check. He'd never finished second grade. He's one of the best educated people I'd ever met. And taking him around to different places. This picture on the bottom is him with the Dalai Lama. By the way, they kind of look alike, but bald, glasses. It was so funny when there was this conference on world religions in Chicago, and Archie went to that. The Dalai Lama was there and wanted to meet Archie because he was the oldest spiritual leader in attendance. And so there's this line of monks coming up, and they started to bow. And Archie had never seen anyone bow before. It was just a foreign concept. He had no idea what to do. So he just started patting everybody on the head, saying, it's okay. It's all right. And unbeknownst to him, in the Buddhist tradition, it's taboo to touch the head, which is a sacred vessel. So the Dalai Lama stops the line and he says, well, how do you greet in your culture? He goes, I don't know, I shake hands. So the Dalai Lama goes to shake hands, and Archie says, no, like this. So they got the arm wrestler handshake. That was pretty fun. As I started my journey with Archie, I was starting other journeys in my life too, including raising this big, crazy mob of kids. It's a big blended family, and it is never dull. I could share a lot of crazy kid stories with you, but I feel like I kind of did a lot of my growing up while helping my kids grow up. And even though I'm in my 50s, I still feel like I got a lot of learning and growing to do. Among the revelations that came to me is that the language and the culture are not just things that are outside of us that we're hungry for. These are things that are inside of us. And the work is not just about looking for the right program, the right person, the right place, but it's also about looking inside. So connection and culture live inside of us. Having a rich cultural life is not just about looking out and looking for, it is about looking within. We can do that wherever we live. The awakening is healing and empowering. So becoming a parent was really transformative for me too. And I remember thinking, I have got to do everything in my power to equip this little human for her best chance at a long, healthy, happy life. And it's terrifying being a parent. Like the number one goal is to not mess your kid up too bad, you know? And I've always felt a little ill-equipped, and that all of my children have scars from their experiences as well as blessings is also humbling. But I said I would only speak Ojibwe with my kid, did my best to do that, especially in her early years. I was pretty successful, and it was amazing to me to watch her wake up in the middle of the night and bring her bottle and say, and she's crying for more milk. And I remember thinking, yes, it's working. It's working. And sometimes she would also humble me. Like one time I got asked to speak at one of the first Ojibwe language conferences in Sault Ste. Marie. They've been going for nearly 30 years now. And I had this kid with me, and she was probably about maybe almost 4 then. And she was literally running in circles around the podium while I'm trying to talk. And finally, her voice gets picked up on the microphone, and she's yelling, Hingi Boogit, which means I farted. And after that, the whole place is just rolling in laughter. No one could hear another word that I had to say, but she left a far greater impression on people than I ever did. They're like, did you hear that little girl? She was speaking Ojibwe. This is awesome. Something's happening. And that was also quite revelatory to me. Today, I'm very proud of this kid as she's navigated everything in her own life. Today, she's part of a team that works with our elders. She's here with Jim Mitchell, one of our esteemed elders from Mille Lacs, transcribing stories. She's a contributor on some of these Ojibwe books that we just worked on out of Mille Lacs. And I'm going to share a little bit more about some of these projects and so forth, and kind of how we go about the work in just a minute. But I just wanted to share that it was so powerful for me seeing her emerge to that level of competency with our language. In many ways, restoring the intergenerational transmission of language in our family. And it's been an imperfect effort. And she's quite humble about what she knows, and will always say, I got so much to learn. I'm clunky. I'm still figuring things out. But that she can roll with our elders and be a major contributor to the work, I think says something powerful too. So if you haven't had a chance, some of you have already been digging into the Language Warriors Manifesto. I won't go through this whole project just in the interest of time, but I wanted to share a little bit of, through this work about what's going on. I share about the importance of language, and I think this is something that I know everybody on today's call understands and believes in, or we wouldn't be here. But not everyone else in our native space gets that. So it's important to have our talking points down and our advocacy down so that we can be effective engineers of language revitalization. So there's some content in there on the importance of language. There's some on the obstacles to successful language revitalization work, many of which are very obvious, like so much of the world is run in colonial languages like English, but some are maybe a little bit less obvious and a little bit more in our control. I do share a bit about my journey with language learning, and I share about a collective journey that is still very much underway. But my experience in this language journey is not isolated. And I think about the heroic work of the folks at, Wadukodading Ojibwe Language Institute in Reserve, Wisconsin on the Lakota Reservation. They hadn't produced a fluent speaker in Lakota since like World War II. And today, there are about 125 kids coming through that school, over the years, and they're running around on the playground hollering at each other in the language. And that is pretty dang remarkable. So something to say is that language revitalization is hard work. It doesn't just happen because it should or because we deserve it. And in fact, the deck is stacked against us. A lot of people don't realize that the greatest predictor of the language that a child will speak is not the language of their parents. It is the language of their peers. And this is why, like immigrants who come to America will speak the heritage language at home with their children. The children will learn English as they go to school, and then they will speak that with their peers. And then when they get married and have kids and things like that, then what happens is English becomes the language in their home. And it's just a couple generations, and the heritage languages tend to fade. There are exceptions. There are strong language enclaves and communities. When I was a kid, there were still a bunch of Norwegian farmers who'd come to the Democratic precinct caucuses and caucus in Norwegian, but that's something that you don't see now. So ultimately, if you think about it, all that's necessary for Ojibwe or Dakota to perish is for us to do nothing. Most of the people who are having and raising children are not fluent speakers. There are some exceptions, but, and there are grandparents raising kids and things like that too. But for the most part, the peer language has been English. And so it requires a special intervention. And this is why things like the immersion schools and programs are so powerful. It's not just the way we go about delivering academic content, but it's reestablishing the peer language as the target language. Also, we got 6,700 languages spoken on the planet. 2,500 are highly endangered, spoken by a tiny handful of elders. We've got about 130 tribal languages spoken in the US and Canada. Only 20 are spoken by kids. Only 4 of those have such a large population of speakers, they'll definitely be here 100 years from now, and the rest depend on what we're doing. Even like, for example, Manitoulin Island has a bunch of communities. And if you look at this region in Canada, Wequemacong is famed for its production of fluent speakers. But even there, you're seeing language shift and loss. Only about 20% of the homes report using Ojibwe as the daily language in the home. And you're seeing a big drop, even in some of these stronger language enclaves. We're also highly segregated. We put the first graders with the first graders and the elders with the elders in an old folks home. And, that intergenerational transmission of language and culture is really threatened. And so if we say, and I've heard people say this before, it has to start in the home. If it doesn't start in the home, if it doesn't happen in the home, it's not going to work. But if it has to start in the home, it's never going to start. In many ways, you could say an immersion school program, things like that, it's second best. And I wouldn't even argue that really. But we need to pick up second best, because the number one way people would learn the language is not happening widely enough with enough people to sustain a population of fluent speakers for either Ojibwe or Dakota. We also see, the normalization of English, the structural supports for English, in our legal systems, in the allocation of money, in the way that we do education, all kinds of things. And both outside and inside our communities, we see a lack of awareness, involvement, commitment. We see oppression dynamics, people being mean to our own people. The idea that our languages are just pretty birds singing in the forest. It'd be nice to hear the pretty birds, but what really matters is something else. And the idea that, materialism is what matters the most, that if it doesn't have an obvious financial value, it just doesn't have value. But it doesn't have to have financial value to have value. And frankly, there is a market and there is a financial value to this too. By the way, if you talk to the Seminole, it's really interesting because I see a lot of our tribal leaders, some with great integrity, others maybe a little less so, but they're climbing this mountain of sovereignty and economic prosperity. And these are worthy mountains to climb. But if you talk to the Seminole, they've climbed those mountains and done a pirouette on the tippy top. They've eliminated poverty for all of their tribal citizenry. They own international businesses like the Hard Rock Cafe enterprise. And they would write a check to the state of Florida just to fill the state's budget shortfall in education. And the governor of Florida is saying, thank you, Mr. Chairman, sir. I will take your ideas and I'm going to put them at the top of my agenda when I go to the governor's conference with the President of the United States, sir. But if you ask the Seminole, well, what keeps you up at night? They'll always say language and culture loss. So my concern is that if we have tunnel vision on climbing the mountain of sovereignty and economic prosperity, then we'll get to the top, look around and go, oh my God, we just climbed the wrong mountain. We should have been climbing the mountain of language and culture revitalization when we had all of our elders and speakers. Also, as a matter of practicality, well, those of us in this Zoom room see, believe, and understand the importance of our languages, not everyone else does. And while it would be nice if everyone else met us where we want to be, we got to go meet our people where they're at. And frankly, a lot of our people are struggling with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, tier 1, the food, clothing, shelter, health, safety, that's tier 2. And so we need to attend to these things. And shaming someone is not an effective strategy for language revitalization. It's also not an effective strategy for social justice. Even shaming white people about white privilege just drives them away from the conversation. We need to establish relationship, build relationship, and then take them somewhere. And it's a really important part of the work. I could recommend Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I felt like I needed a thesaurus and a bottle of aspirin to get through that book. It's super academic, but it's brilliant. And in kind of layman's terms, these are some of the biggest takeaways for me. You could take, and for the sake of irony, because I enjoy that, an oppressed group like the Pilgrims. They're being oppressed in England for their religious beliefs. They get into boats. They go across the ocean and escape from their oppressors. Was that the end of oppression? Hardly. Where was the oppression then? And the answer is, it wasn't just left behind in England. They carried it inside of themselves as oppressed people with them across the ocean. And once they got to America, where did it show up? And it showed up in their communities, internalized oppression. So that's, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I can't do this, blame and shame stuff in the Puritan example. Lateral oppression, being mean to their own people. So that's the crabs in the bucket kind of treatment. In their case, Salem witch trials as an example. Then they started being mean to other people. So you get, Puritans beating up on natives and blacks and so forth. And then as the recipients of the oppression dynamic, we did the same things to everybody else. And so Freire would say there are 4 pillars that hold up oppression. Only one is an external agent keeping us down, the man, so to speak. The other 3, internalized, lateral, and intra-oppressed group oppression, all happen inside the oppressed community. That means of the 4 pillars, and by the way, those 3, the internalized, lateral, and intra-oppressed group oppression, they all serve white supremacy and English language dominance. The man keeping us down doesn't even have to do 25% of the work. We're doing the rest of it. It also means that of these 4 pillars that hold up oppression, 3 of them are in our communities and in our control. So we can check ourselves every time we've been tempted to think, I'm dumb, I'll never learn my language, I can't do it. That's the internalized oppression speaking. Knock it off, right? Every time we do the crabs in the bucket, like, man, you see that dude, he's probably got a beaded pen in his beaded briefcase, bet he thinks he's better than everybody. Or even when, and this happens in my family, my brothers and I like to banter. When does that, like friendly, fun teasing turn into hurting someone or putting someone in their place? I got to check that. And it's hard to see sometimes. And then, a lot of times we are so wounded with our own victimizations that we forget to hold up other people. It becomes just us instead of justice. And it's important that as Ojibwe people, we hold up support and believe in and connect with our Dakota brothers and sisters, and vice versa, and not leave ourselves isolated. Similarly, we can't abandon the causes of racial justice outside of the Indigenous experience. We need to hold each other up, build coalitions and relationships to be effective. The Hawaiians are quite famous for their language revitalization work and success, and deservedly so. They had been inspired by the Maori, who are really probably the first large-scale successful Indigenous language revitalization effort on the planet. Among the things that I've really appreciated about the Hawaiian effort, in addition to its Indigenous medium approach to education, where you don't have to find an extra half hour at the end of the day to spend on our language, in their case with Hawaiian, but because you're doing everything in Hawaiian, you make much more efficient use of time. I've appreciated the way that they have had a sensible political approach. Some people were like, we're just going to deal with the politics. Initially Hawaiian was illegal for use in public schools. They fought to overturn that law. Then they kept fighting until Hawaiian was one of the official languages for the entire state of Hawaii, and they're still fighting for every road sign to be changed to a Hawaiian name, fighting for every town's name to be changed to its Hawaiian name, things like that. And in addition to that, I appreciate the way that they effectively center Hawaiian culture and values. You ever been part of one of these like mission and vision statement things where you're like yawning and crawling out of your skin and want to get the heck out of there? Because by the time everybody checks down on it, they could just say, we believe in education. I was like, see, you could have just pulled that from the internet and spared me the time. I've been in a lot of those. But if you've ever been in one that actually effectively works, it's powerful. So like, you might hear people talk about 7 grandfather teachings, in a Ojibwe context. in Hawaiian culture, they actually list a series of values. There's 12 of them. The first ones are probably words that would be known even to someone outside of Hawaii. Aloha, which means hello, goodbye, and I love you. Ohana, which means family. And so some of the way they live their cultural experience within the schools is very, very powerful this way. Like when they start, they bring a new kid into the school, they have to have all the families go and pick medicines, and they weave a giant lei that goes over the door to the school. And everybody walks through that every day. When they assemble everyone, there's an exchange of promises between the family and the school. And the family has to say, we are taking our most sacred human being, our daughter, and we are entrusting her to your care, asking you to accept her into your ohana, to love her as your own, respect her as your own, and cherish her as your own. And the school has to answer back, we are humbled and honored that you have thought us worthy to receive your daughter. We will accept her into our ohana. We will love her like our own. And man, that little cultural protocol does so much to get in front of the thinking that some parents have that I'm going to send my kid to school to be warehoused so I can just go to work, or an adversarial disposition with who's doing the educating. It does a lot. At the start of school every day, every kid, is piling out of buses and getting dropped off by straggling parents or whatever. And the whole staff is waiting in front of the school in lines. And once the kids get there and assemble, they do what these kids are doing and they sing, asking for permission to come in the school. And when the staff feels they're sincere, they sing back. And then every kid gets a hug from everyone who works at the school every single day. Aloha. And I think in the mainstream, we'd be thinking, are you serious? 45 minutes on cultural enrichment at the start of the day? Our kids are awake in the morning. Make them do math. Until you realize that they have a 100% graduation rate at Navahi, for example, the flagship immersion school on the Big Island in Hawaii. And they don't have a statistically significant truancy problem. So if someone's figuring out how to deal with that stuff, we need to pay more attention to that. So some of their cultural framings, I think, are especially powerful and worth looking at. We've been busy trying to do this in the Ojibwe world too. Rose Tainter saying we want an Ojibwe immersion school like those Hawaiians got, and they got one, Wadukodading. I think every piece of the puzzle matters. So this is just a crazy white guy in Bemidji who we convinced to go door to door, asking people to put up bilingual signage for bathrooms and things like that. Now our regional event center, the hospital, all the public schools, the university post bilingual signs, and it continues to grow and proliferate. We even got bilingual signage on the cop cars. Check it out. Gunawain Jigang, Minawa Na Damagang, to protect and serve. You're probably familiar with the First Speakers video, which profiles some of the efforts at some of the immersion schools, some of our stronger language enclaves and so forth. There's some pretty cool stuff going on. Recently, I've been really privileged and honored to work with the Mille Band of Ojibwe in a number of contexts. So this is some of our Jedi Council. And when I was called to this meeting, it was a number of years ago now. They said, hey, we have some overages from grants and we want to do something with language. What should we do? And they had quite a bit of money. And I just rolled out the list of everything that I thought we should do. At that time, they had identified 25 fluent first speakers of Ojibwe in Mille Lacs, only 25. And just 30 years ago, there were hundreds. I said, there's no way for them to do all the teaching with all the kids. We need to set them up to teach people for hundreds of years to come. And they said, well, let's do everything. And by the way, through the pandemic, we estimate that we lost 20% of our remaining first speakers of Ojibwe. It was heartbreaking. And they include some of the folks in this picture here. So among the things we did is we started working on books. And we produced through the pandemic 5 books. I was so stunned when we had a big book launch event down in Mille Lacs, and Joe Naquinabe was there. He's one of the esteemed elders and contributors on the books. And through the pandemic, his sister had died from COVID, and his brother had a COVID infection and died from heart complications, possibly related to his COVID infection. And I thought he would be saying, you know, speaking to his heartache. And he got up there and he said, we did 5 books. We had to teach our elders how to do Zoom. And I think working on these books was the best time of my life. And man, I was just ready to bawl. I couldn't believe that that was his disposition about it. But he said, we've been waiting for so long to really get going. And it felt like we were really getting going. And we worked out partnerships with the Minnesota Historical Society, which has published all of these books, keeps them in print in perpetuity, handles marketing and distribution. Royalties go back to the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. All the elder contributors were paid for their work and time, and everybody's pretty excited about them. I think famously now, you know, Mille Lacs on March 1st, Tuesday of next week, does the public rollout of Rosetta Stone. And this contract was set up in such an interesting way. They basically prepaid Rosetta Stone for a service, but the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe retains all of the copyrights, intellectual and cultural copyrights, can repurpose anything produced for anything that they want to do, and collects 100% of the royalties and fees. So our estimates are actually that the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe will recuperate all of their fees, and that this will have cost them nothing. In addition, it is just a sophisticated tool for language instruction. And Muskogee Creek did a 2-year development on Rosetta Stone. Navajo did a 1-year. And there have been some other tribal languages looking at this. We're going to have a 6-year development. Year 1 has 12 main units. There are 12 to 20, sections within each unit. It uses audio, video, an artificial intelligence engine that can help correct your speech and pronunciation as you interact with the app in real time. It overcomes the fact that half our tribal population lives off-res, and 70% of our self-identified Native population lives off-res. It means everyone can get it if you have a smartphone, or a computer or what have you. And so I think this will also be part of setting up those elders to teach people for hundreds of years to come. I'm really proud of the effort. And again, all of the contributors are, the elders are being paid for their time and effort. And there are a lot of second language learners who've been pulled into the effort and are learning as part of the production process and so forth. Among the things I've learned is that the language is not just an inheritance from our ancestors or a gift from our elders to us. It's something that works both ways. It's like this Carl Jung quote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. So I'll leave you with a couple quick shares. This is just a view off the front deck of my house. I feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. But among things that had happened when my folks were getting started is they had acquired this farm that had been taken in a tax forfeiture for relatively little money. But it didn't look like this when they're getting started. It looked like this: wide open land, farm fields, and they started planting trees. And in fact, planted all of the trees in this picture here. It completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. That was just a couple people with a child labor force. That's me. And what a change. So to me, it is empowering to think. When I think about how do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with revitalizing our languages? A lot of us look at that and think, oh, there's not a lot I can do. And we feel hopeless. But it's not like we got to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and move that mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and ecosystem. That's the work. That's the work that we're doing in language revitalization. We are planting the seeds and nourishing them and helping them grow. I'm going to skip through my little Anna Gibbs section. She's one of my great heroes. And I'll just leave you with this. Starting pretty soon, if the weather breaks in a couple of weeks or something, we're going to open up our family sugar bush. And when our children have been born, we followed Anna's directions and took the placentas for our children, went out in the woods and buried them by maple trees, which is a tree of life. Some other people will put the placentas by a white pine tree, which is a symbol of longevity. But we put ours by the maple trees. And when we open up our family sugar bush, I'll actually have the kids do the prayer, to the Manitug and Adasukanag. And I'll have the kids tell the legend about the sugar bush, which explains how we got this gift of getting food from the tree. And then they'll put tobacco down all over at the trees where their placentas are buried. And they pull life out of the trees of life. And it has been so healing as we brought my grandmother out there. After her going through residential boarding schools, watching her daughter, my mom, me, and now my kids, restoring this intergenerational transmission of culture and language. And so our capacity to heal in all of these regards is profound. I get it wrong all the time. I stumble and bumble all the time. I mess up all the time. And there is no outcome that should be taken for granted. It's not guaranteed. But we can do this, all of us. And I believe in this work. And I believe in all of you to do this work. I've often heard people talk about living in two worlds, which is really talking about code switching back and forth, dealing with assimilation. But I think it's important to remind people it's one world. We don't live in two worlds. We live in one world. We don't have to code switch to make it out there. We don't have to maintain a dual consciousness. People from other cultures don't have to sacrifice theirs to enter our world, and natives don't have to sacrifice their cultures to navigate the modern world. We can be exactly who we are, exactly who the Creator wanted us to be, and thrive. And with that, I want to say Chimigwech for listening and showing up today. I sure appreciate you. Miigwech.
Piramiyayiro, Wopide Chichupi. So that was Dr. Anton Troyer. I want to say thank you on behalf of our conference here. And we'll be now reconvening at 10:15 this morning. And we'll have two different workshops available to you all. One will be the winter counts with TPZ Wing Tolman, and another with Leslie Harper. So yeah, see you all then. Enjoy your break. Gigawabaman. Doksta. Okay.